Hello everyone and welcome to today's video. We'll be unpacking a fascinating game that Garry Kasparov played back in 1993 against Nigel. I picked this game because I find it very instructive in terms of how to play when you have control of the center of the board. A lot of us understand the concept that in chess we need to control the center of the board. But what do we do when we have that control? Well, in this game, Garry Kasparov will show us. He has the white pieces and he starts with d4. Nigel plays d5, c4, e6. We have a queen's gambit declined, knight to c3, knight f6, and we have an exchange of pawns in the center. C takes d5 and e takes d5. So we might have a Carlsbad structure here, which is a very common pawn structure in chess. Bishop to g5, pinning the knight. Bishop to e7, e3, black castles, and bishop to d3. All very standard stuff so far. White is maintaining flexibility in terms of what he does with his kingside knight, whether he goes to f3 or e2. Black plays knight d7, and now Kasparov plays his signature approach, knight to e2. The idea is very simple. By not having the knight on f3, the f pawn is mobilized, so it can push forward and support an e4 break in the center. Black plays his rook out to e8, very logical. He's anticipating action in the center of the board, so that rook is nicely placed there. White castles, and black plays knight to f8, a very useful multi-purpose move here. Guarding h7, as in these structures it's very common for the white queen to land on c2, and together with the bishop on d3 create a battery and pressure against h7. So having that knight there on f8 is very useful. Not only that knight might be coming into e6 to harass that dark squared bishop. And now, if you're not familiar with the theoretical lines in this position, you might be a bit shocked at this next move. Kasparov plays b4. Isn't black's bishop just guarding that point on b4? What's happening here? Well, in the game, Nigel actually just played a6, which is the theoretical continuation. But let's have a look and see what happens if instead he just took that pawn. If in this position here, black plays bishop takes b4, what white does is he first takes on f6, and we can see the issue now. Black would really like to take that bishop back with his queen to maintain a nice configuration of the pawns in front of his king. But we can see the issue is that by moving his queen to f6, he's no longer guarding d5, so the knight comes in, picks up d5, hitting the queen and the bishop. It's not all lost for black though. He can hang on to things. He can bring his queen back to d6, saving his queen and protecting the bishop at the same time. But in this position, white has a very strong move. Queen to a4. We are hitting the bishop with the knight and the queen, but the queen is also hitting this rook on e8 as well. So this is a nice position for white. So that is why typically black is not taking that pawn on b4. So after Kasparov played b4 here, Nigel instead played a6. And now Kasparov guards his pawn on b4 with a3. We have c6. Black sets himself up for a nice solid pawn chain here on the queen side. And we have queen to c2, developing the queen and placing some pressure on h7 as well. We have g6. Now, why was g6 needed? You might think, well, don't I have a lot of defense here as black onto h7? Black would like to get his knight onto e6 to start harassing that dark squared bishop. But if he does that, we simply remove that knight and we pick up a pawn here as white. So that is why in this position here, instead of playing the immediate knight to e6, we have g6. And now Kasparov plays his signature approach in the Carlsbad. He plays f3, looking for a timely e4. And I say timely because white has to be very careful not to push that pawn too soon. And I'll explain that just shortly. So after f3, we have knight to e6 from black, hitting the bishop on g5. The bishop drops back to h4. And in this position here, black plays a very common and interesting maneuver with the aim of exchanging pieces. He plays knight to h5, offering an exchange of dark squared bishops. And whenever we're talking about exchange of pieces, we always need to ask ourselves the question, well, who benefits from this exchange? If we can imagine these two bishops getting exchanged off for each other, who actually benefits from that? Is it white that's happier or is it black that's happier? I actually think that both sides, funnily enough, are quite happy with this exchange. First of all, we can see that white has more space in general in the position. He has more control of the center of the board. He has more space on the queen side as well. Generally, when you have less space, you would like to exchange pieces. So that is the argument of why black would like to exchange a set of pieces, because he has less space. At the same time, we can see that at the moment, all of black's pawns are on light squares, which means that black's dark squared bishop is a very important piece, because when the pawns are on light squares, it means that the pieces have to control the dark squares. So this is a very important piece here. So there's a very strong argument that both sides are actually okay with this exchange. So let's see who's right about this. Kasparov takes on e7 and short retakes with the rook. Rook takes e7. And now in this position, Kasparov plays queen to d2. That pawn move f3 has left e3 somewhat tender. I just wanted to go back there and just highlight that in this previous position, we can see that pushing e4 immediately is absolutely not an option, because black simply takes that pawn, and after white retakes, d4 is hanging. He's got the knight and the queen attacking d4, and white only has one defender. So black is simply picking up a central pawn for free in that variation, and he is completely winning this game. So white needs to be very careful that he doesn't push e4 too soon and that he has his d4 square covered. So the typical plan for guarding d4 usually involves getting the heavy pieces on the d-file and slotting that bishop back. That is when white considers pushing forward with e4. So in this position, we first have queen to d2 with some x-ray defense on d4 and protecting e3 as well. We have b6. Black is looking to develop his light squared bishop, and rook to d1. We are getting very close now to being able to push forward e4. Just one more step is needed. We need to get our light squared bishop out of the way. Black develops with bishop to b7. And now finally, Kasparov plays the last move in preparation for e4. He slots that bishop back to b1, clearing the path for the heavy pieces to guard the d4 pawn. So now white is poised and ready to strike the center with e4. Knight to g7. Black is re-coordinating his pieces. And now finally, we have e4. Now, from here on out, it's very instructive how Kasparov treats his central configuration. We have rook to c8, hinting at a potential break on the queen side with c5. And now we have a quiet-looking move from Kasparov, bishop to a2, but it's actually a very powerful move. We are placing pressure in the center of the board here on d5, but not only that, the bishop is x-raying f7 as well, and we can imagine that if there is an exchange of pawns here in the center of the board, that bishop and the rook would be combining quite nicely on f7. We have rook to d7 from black, and this looks quite menacing from black, right? He's got a lot of pressure down the center of the board here. He could be hinting at looking to open up that d-file and just crash through in the center of the board here. So Kasparov first plays knight to f4. We have an exchange of knights. Knight takes f4, queen takes f4, and knight to e6, hitting the white queen. Garry steps forward with this queen to e5, and now an interesting position here. I want to ask the viewers, we can see that there is a bit of a tender point here on d4. We have a lot of x-ray pressure with the heavy pieces from black, and the knight is hitting d4 as well. So my question to the viewer here is, in this position, can black open up the d-file with d takes e4 and look to potentially just pick up that pawn on d4? Is d takes e4 here a good move for black? Have a moment to think about that. Okay, in the game, Nigel played rook to e7, lining his rook up against the white queen, but let's see what happens on d takes e4. The refutation is very interesting actually. It's knight takes e4, and the point here is that with the knight on e4, we are threatening to fork the king and the rook. And the point is that if black were to try to sidestep that by taking on d4 with his rook, it's not knight to f6 that's the crushing blow. Actually, it's knight to d6. Have a look at this. Interferes the queen's protection on the rook. It is hitting the rook on c8. It is hitting the unprotected bishop on b7 as well. So actually the best continuation in this position here is for black to take the knight with the queen. And after this exchange, we've essentially won an exchange here as white. Okay, so that is why Nigel did not take on e4 and open up the d-file. Back in this position here, he instead played rook to e7. Kasparov gets his queen out of harm's way, dropping back to g3. We have queen to c7. Nigel is offering an exchange of queens, and Kasparov declines that with queen to h4. Nigel plays knight g7, looking to potentially double up on the e-file and place some pressure down that file. Rook to c1, lining up the rook against the black queen. Nigel gets his queen out of the way with queen to d8, and at the same time, he's threatening to now open up the d-file and pick up that pawn on d4 with check. So we have rook f to d1 from Kasparov, defending that pawn here on d4. We have rook c to c7 from Nigel Shaw. And we have now knight to b6. With his last move, he's blocked the queen's protection on the b6 point. So now knight a4 is now genuinely threatening to take the pawn on b6. But instead of just playing passively, Nigel first takes the pawn on e4. And after the recapture, f takes e4. We have queen to e8. The point being that if Garry were to take the pawn on b6, Short would be taking on e4 with tempo against the queen. So that is why in this position, Kasparov drops his knight back to c3 to guard the e4 point. Nigel adds further pressure to the center of the board. Rook c to d7 with queen to f2. And one of the things that I wanted to call out is that just over the past handful of moves, notice that Kasparov has been very disciplined in holding these pawns together in this configuration of d4 and e4. When these central pawns are together like this, they are very powerful. So why is it that keeping these pawns together like this is so powerful? Shouldn't we just continue to march our army up the board and create space? The main thing I wanted to call out is that let's imagine we push forward e4, e5. We can see that by pushing forward e4 to e5, we're actually giving black these two squares here. We're giving him f5 and d5. We can see that in this configuration, this pawn is guarding those squares. But when we move that pawn forward, suddenly black has these two squares to work with. And similarly with the d pawn, if we are pushing forward d4 to d5, we can see that this pawn is guarding e5 and c5. So we can think that, well, if this pawn's going forward, can black do something with suddenly having access to these squares? That is why when you have this central configuration like this, oftentimes it's very important to be disciplined and push forward at the right time. When you push forward, you're giving your opponent squares. And so we just need to be careful that we are okay with those squares that we are giving our opponent. Okay, let's continue on with the game. Short plays knight to e6, which is actually the critical mistake in the game. And now is the time to push forward. If you had the white pieces in this position, would you push e5 here or would you push d5? Kasparov chose the right sequence. He pushed e5. Now, I just gave that long talk about how strong those central pawns are when they are together. Why is it now that pushing these pawns forward and giving up these squares is the right thing to do? One of the most important things that you need to understand about pushing pawns forward in the center of the board, a lot of the times pushing forward in the center of the board is not about creating pawn breaks and crushing your opponent's structure. It's generally two things. One, it's about controlling certain squares, and we can see that by pushing forward e4, e5, this pawn now controls d6 and f6. So that's point number one, controlling squares. Point number two, and oftentimes this is the even more important point and something that you need to become familiar with as a strategy. It's about vacating squares for your other pieces. By pushing forward e4 to e5, White now has e4 as a launch pad for his own pieces. So the deadly threat in this position for White is to come into e4 with his knight, where he'd be threatening a monster check here on f6, which would be hitting the king, the queen, and the rook. So this e4 square is going to be an absolutely devastating launch pad for the white pieces here. Nigel Shaw tries for dear life to prevent the knight from landing on e4 by playing c5. So now his bishop is guarding e4, preventing the knight from getting there. But now we simply have b takes c5, b takes c5, and now we push forward d5. Remember how I was saying that those pawns on d4 and e4 next to each other were very strong? Well, they get even stronger when they're on d5 and e5. The knight here is under attack, so it steps forward, knight to d4. And at first glance, it might look strong for black because it looks like he has a lot of pressure on the e-file. Can he just scoop up this pawn on e5? Are these pawns overextended now? We can see that black is doubled up on the e-file and white has no defenders. So is white simply losing a pawn here? We all know Garry Kasparov. He's not concerned with measly pawns. He's a lot more ambitious than that. Knight to e4, exclamation mark. He is looking to come into f6 once again with that devastating check, which would be picking up absolutely everything. The pawn on d5 here is blocking the bishop from exchanging itself off for that knight. There is no stopping that knight landing on f6 now. The best that black can do is simply make sure he doesn't lose his queen here. He plays queen to d8, making sure that knight to f6 does not pick up the queen, but Kasparov plays knight to f6 anyway. King to g7. He's picked up an exchange, knight takes d7, rook takes d7. Black has a lot of pressure now on d5 with his bishop and his heavy pieces as well. But here Kasparov simply picks up the pawn on c5, and in doing so, that knight on d4, which looked very dangerous and glorious, is now hanging as it's being under attack by the queen and the rook. So he has to do something to guard his knight. He drops it back to e6, a nice and creative move here. He is hitting the rook and taking advantage of this pin. Kasparov cannot take the knight because he would lose his rook here on d1, and that would be absolutely devastating. So in this position, Kasparov simply drops his rook back to c1 as it was under attack. And in this position, Nigel should just resign the game because he is pretty much busted here. First, we can see that actually Kasparov in this position is not actually threatening to take that knight because he still has issues here, right, on the back rank. But the point is that black cannot take that pawn on d5 because there is this very nice tactical shot here that wins the piece. We can see that the light square bishop in the center of the board here is under attack by 2 pieces, but black also is defending it with 2 pieces. Can we remove one of these defenders with tempo? Yes, we can. There is this nice tactical shot here, queen to f6 with check, and the point is, after black takes the queen, we retake the queen with check, and that gets us the tempo that we need as white to pick up that loose bishop in the center of the board. So that is why in this position back here, if the knight isn't under attack because of the back rank issues, and if the bishop can't take d5 because of queen f6, what happens on another random move like h5? White simply resolves his back rank issues. He slots his rook back to f1. Now the knight is under attack. And if, for example, we do something like knight g5, d6 is absolutely crushing because we have opened up our bishop on f7. h4 is coming next, dislodging the knight, which is protecting f7, and white is basically just crashing through here. What an absolutely fascinating game here that Garry Kasparov played all the way back in 1993 and demonstrated to us how to properly play when you have that nice central configuration of d4 and e4. Okay, thanks, and I hope everyone has enjoyed this video.